They were called the families. They lived by a code older than the country itself, and for nearly a century, they ran America from the shadows. Every week, we open the files on the men who built the underworld, the bosses, the wars, the rituals, the betrayals, the blood oaths that bound them, and the secrets they swore to take to the grave. Subscribe. Some stories were never meant to be told.
The Rise of Big Tim Sullivan and the Birth of the New York Irish Mob. It is a twisted, tragic work of underworld history that Big Tim Sullivan, the legendary boss of the Old 5 Points, benefactor of the vicious Wyos gang, and a man who rose from the slums to serve in the United States Congress, never lived to see the blood-soaked glory days of Prohibition. When he died under mysterious circumstances in September 1913, he missed out on the greatest criminal gold rush the world had ever seen. Yet, the bitter irony is that Big Tim, perhaps more than any other man, laid the very foundation that allowed organized crime to flourish during the Noble Experiment. He created an insidious, inescapable network of corruption that muckraking journalist Lincoln Steffens famously dubbed the system with a capital S, a massive racketeering enterprise that today would easily be dismantled under federal RICO laws. The system was a beautifully ruthless machine powered by two unstoppable engines, raw muscle and political patronage. In an era when wealthy WASP industrialists like Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt were brazenly telling the press let the public be damned, street-level political bosses like Sullivan played the role of the working man's savior. Sullivan knew exactly how to work a desperate crowd. At political rallies, he would emotionally recount his own impoverished childhood as one of 6 children crammed into a tiny apartment, remembering nights when his mother sang them to sleep just to distract them from the fact that they were starving. Big Tim didn't judge the neighborhood thugs who broke the law. He publicly proclaimed that thieves were driven by sheer necessity, stealing only to pay for a doctor or to put bread on the table. To him, politics was a vehicle to dispense favors and protect the community while they scratched out a living. But behind this benevolent, Robin Hood facade operated a fiercely corrupt syndicate backed by boss Richard Croker, the Grand Sachem of Tammany Hall. Croker was a former brawler from the Gas House District and leader of the 4th Avenue Tunnel Gang who had beaten a murder rap before taking the reins of the city's political apparatus. Operating under the protection of Tammany's Irish triumvirate, Honest John Kelly, Croker, and later Charles F. Murphy, Big Tim Sullivan became fabulously wealthy. He amassed a shadowy empire that included the Sullivan-Considine vaudeville circuit, the Metropole Hotel, early Nickelodeon theaters, and various racetracks and saloons in Coney Island. Sullivan's true genius, however, was his street-level diplomacy. Representing the most ethnically diverse district in America, the Lower East Side, he learned to speak phrases in Yiddish, Italian, and Cantonese. He brokered strategic alliances with notorious gang leaders across ethnic lines, including Paul Kelly, an Italian immigrant born Paolo Antonini Vaccarelli who led the 5 Points Gang, and Monk Eastman, the brawny boss of a predominantly Jewish crew. The gangs delivered the votes and the muscle on Election Day. In return, Sullivan used his stable of crooked magistrate judges to keep the gangsters out of prison and allowed them to run their rackets free from police harassment. Perhaps Big Tim's most lethal contribution to the future of the American underworld was his mentorship of a fresh-faced, 16-year-old Jewish kid named Arnold Rothstein. Rothstein started out as a humble Yiddish translator for Sullivan at the Hesper Club on the Bowery. Big Tim recognized the kid's razor-sharp head for numbers and took him under his wing, telling him to drop the formalities and just call him Tim. Rothstein would eventually evolve into the brain and the big bankroll, the ultimate financier of the underworld who allegedly orchestrated the fixing of the 1919 World Series, and he always credited Big Tim Sullivan as the mentor who made his dark empire possible. But karma in the underworld is a vicious, inescapable collector. By 1912, Big Tim's empire began to collapse as his body and mind were ravaged by tertiary syphilis. He deteriorated into a state of severe paranoia and delusion. In the summer of 1913, he had to be locked away in a Bronx sanitarium with guards watching his every move. Occasionally, he would escape his handlers, wandering his old haunts along Broadway in his pajamas like a ghost, spotted briefly by old cronies before vanishing back into the shadows. Finally, on a dark September night, after exhausting his guards in a marathon card game, he slipped away for good. His mangled corpse was discovered on the train tracks near the Westchester freight yards. It lay unidentified in the morgue for days. Though he was given a massive funeral attended by U.S. senators and mobsters alike, the tragedy was absolute. Big Tim Sullivan had built the blueprint for the golden age of American crime, yet died a broken, insane man before he could reap the billions that Prohibition would soon deliver. When the Volstead Act finally became the law of the land, it wasn't viewed by the immigrant masses as a triumph of morality. To the Irish, Germans, Jews, and Italians, Prohibition was a direct, bigoted assault by WASP elites in the anti-saloon league on their liberties and culture. For the Irish, whose social and political lives had revolved around the neighborhood saloon for centuries, this was nothing short of a declaration of war. The American public quickly realized they still desperately wanted their liquor, and the Irish-American racketeers were perfectly positioned to supply the demand. Enter William Vincent Dwyer, better known on the streets as Big Bill. Born in Hell's Kitchen, Dwyer was a former dock walloper and stevedore who cut his teeth in the brutal ranks of the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA. He wasn't a traditional, gun-toting street thug, but he possessed a brilliant logistical mind and knew exactly how to cultivate and command muscle. Big Bill didn't just sell bathtub gin, he organized a massive, international maritime smuggling operation. He purchased steel-plated speedboats outfitted with airplane engines to outrun the authorities, establishing the infamous Rum Row just past the 3-mile international limit off the Atlantic coast. Dwyer's ultimate genius was recognizing that none of this could work without entirely corrupting the law enforcement agencies assigned to stop him. He systematically paid off the U.S. Coast Guard, local police, and even federal prohibition agents. The dirty money flowed in absolute torrents, allowing Dwyer to build a legitimate-looking empire that included hotels, racetracks, casinos, and professional ice hockey teams. Yet, even with millions pouring in and the authorities firmly in his pocket, Big Bill faced a deadly logistical nightmare. Once the smuggled booze hit the docks, it had to be transported overland via trucks to warehouses and speakeasies. America's backroads rapidly devolved into a blood-soaked shooting gallery as renegade hijackers and rival gangs aggressively picked off Dwyer's shipments to sell the liquor themselves. To protect his empire, the king of the rum runners realized he needed more than just corrupt cops, he needed cold-blooded killers. He needed to organize the most dangerous men in the city, setting the stage for an unprecedented, violent alliance that would officially birth the ruthless New York Irish Mob. The rise of the New York Irish Mob. Ratified on January 19, 1919, the 18th Amendment and the subsequent Volstead Act were supposed to dry out the nation and put an end to the liquor trade. But let me tell you, folks, the American public wasn't about to go thirsty. At first, desperate citizens tried to cook up their own booze, turning their kitchens and basements into makeshift, highly dangerous distilleries. The results were absolutely horrific. Amateur brewers were churning out a mud-brown liquid that smelled like mash and tasted like train cleaner, and the bathtub gin made from raw alcohol, glycerin, and juniper oil was causing gastritis and acute alcohol poisoning across the country. The people didn't want this toxic swill, they were willing to pay top dollar to get their hands on the real McCoy, setting the stage for the greatest criminal gold rush in American history. For the Irish-American community, Prohibition wasn't a triumph of morality, it was an act of war. They viewed the temperance movement and the anti-saloon league's crusade as a direct, bigoted assault by the WASP elite against their very way of life. The neighborhood saloon was the beating heart of the Irish community, it was the sacred ground where friendships were born, political alliances were forged, and grudges were settled. Facing what they saw as a targeted attack on their culture and their livelihoods, many Irishmen felt it was their absolute duty to subvert the law. And nowhere was the demand for illicit liquor higher than in New York City, which quickly became the wettest metropolis in the entire country. The underworld desperately needed a mastermind to supply this massive demand, and they found him in William Vincent Dwyer, famously known on the gritty streets as Big Bill. Born in the notorious Hell's Kitchen neighborhood on Manhattan's 10th Avenue, Dwyer cut his teeth as a dock walloper and stevedore for the International Longshoremen's Association, ILA. He wasn't your typical street thug looking to shoot his way to the top. Working as a local bookmaker, he mingled comfortably with the city's most violent men. But what truly set him apart was his brilliant logistical mind. Big Bill realized early on that controlling the illicit booze market meant establishing a foolproof system to smuggle high-quality liquor into the country without getting harassed by the Coast Guard, federal prohibition agents, or local cops. Dwyer didn't just smuggle a few crates in the dead of night, he built a staggering international maritime empire. With funds accumulated from supplying small garage-level bootleggers, he assembled a crack team of businessmen and former gang members. He purchased seagoing rum ships and a fleet of steel-plated speedboats outfitted with airplane engines and machine guns to outrun the authorities. Operating out of two Midtown Manhattan offices, including one in the Lowe's State Building in Times Square, Dwyer connected with major liquor suppliers in England, Canada, and the Caribbean. He established the legendary Rum Row in the outer Atlantic, a corridor sitting just past the 3-mile international limit where ships would rendezvous at sea, offload the product onto his speedboats, and run it ashore to coastal cities and islands. From there, heavily armed teamster convoys transported the booze to warehouses, cutting plants, and wholesale outlets in New York, Florida, Cincinnati, St. Louis, and all the way to Kansas City. In a matter of years, Big Bill Dwyer became the absolute undisputed king of the rum runners and the largest single distributor of illegal booze in the United States. You don't run an empire this massive without having the law deep in your pocket. Dwyer's absolute supremacy over Rum Row hinged on his complete corruption of the U.S. Coast Guard. Using a petty officer named Olson as his point man, Dwyer targeted enlisted guardsmen who were making a paltry $126 a month, or warrant officers pulling in just $153. Dwyer would treat these vulnerable men to a lavish night on the town under the bright lights of Broadway, complete with a sumptuous dinner, theater tickets, a plush hotel suite, and a girl. By the next morning, these lawmen were more than happy to accept bribes that were sometimes 10 times their monthly salary. Dwyer understood perfectly well that military men, local cops, and even federal agents liked to drink, and his ability to buy them off proved that the entire bootlegging racket relied entirely on the willful acquiescence of American law enforcement. As the dirty money poured in like a tidal wave, Dwyer reinvented himself as a legitimate upperworld businessman. He funneled his massive illicit profits into hotels, racetracks, restaurants, and nightclubs. He even bought 2 gambling casinos in Miami Beach and virtually introduced professional ice hockey to the United States by establishing the New York and American hockey clubs. He lived like absolute royalty, entertaining guests at his sprawling suburban estate in Belle Harbor, Long Island, where he resided with his wife and 5 children. But folks, in the underworld, unimaginable wealth always breeds deadly predators. Big Bill had the high seas and the warehouses locked down, but his supply chain had a fatal vulnerability: the overland transport. America's backroads had devolved into a lawless, blood-soaked shooting gallery. Renegade gangs, smelling the millions to be made, began aggressively hijacking Dwyer's trucks to steal the shipments and outlet the booze themselves. The breaking point arrived in early 1924, when Dwyer was hit with 2 massive hijackings in upstate New York. One was a warehouse job that cost him $16,000, and the other was a brazen truck hijacking in White Plains where thieves made off with an incredible $25,000 worth of his product. Dwyer furiously put the heat on the local cops, which quickly led to the arrest of a 5-man hijacking crew. When Big Bill saw the police report, one name jumped right off the page: Owney Madden. Madden was the infamous former leader of the deadly Gopher gang who had ruled the West Side before being sent to Sing Sing on a murder rap. Dwyer, knowing he wasn't a tough guy himself, realized he had finally found the perfect solution to his hijacking nightmare. Instead of seeking bloody revenge against the man who stole from him, he waited. When the charges against Madden were dropped for lack of evidence, the king of the rum runners sent a message to the notorious killer: "Get me Owney Madden. I want to talk to him. Tell him I got a business proposition we need to discuss." This fateful invitation to bring a ruthless, cold-blooded killer into the corporate fold was the brilliant masterstroke that officially birthed the legendary, ruthless syndicate known forever after as the New York Irish Mob. The rise of Owney the Killer Madden. Forget the bombastic press conferences of Al Capone and the desperate Hollywood delusions of Bugsy Siegel. If you want to understand the real, terrifying power of the Prohibition-era underworld, you have to look into the blood-soaked shadows. True professional criminals don't crave the limelight, they prefer to pull the strings from the dark. Meet Owen Victor Madden, known on the gritty streets of New York as Owney the Killer. He was the undisputed Duke of the West Side, a ruthless predator who buried himself in cash, controlled prize fighters and racehorses, and bedded a string of beautiful women. Yet, he masterfully manipulated the media to keep his name out of the papers, going so far as to buy a luxury Stutz Bearcat automobile for gossip columnist Walter Winchell just to ensure his vast criminal empire stayed off the front page. Born on Christmas Day in 1891 in Liverpool, England, Madden was the son of destitute, post-famine Irish parents. After his father passed away in 1903, the young boy was shipped across the Atlantic with his brother and sister to live with an aunt in Hell's Kitchen. Stretching along the west side docks of the Hudson River, this brutal, cold-water tenement district had supplanted the old Five Points as the ultimate proving ground for young Irish ruffians. Owney assimilated with terrifying speed. He shed his British accent for a thick New York street patois, though he would occasionally fake an upper-crust English accent later in life to mask his gutter origins. Before long, He was absorbed into the infamous Gopher Gang, a notoriously violent crew that operated out of dark tenement basements and frequently warred with rivals like the Hudson Dusters. Through sheer guile and daring, Owney eclipsed the older thugs to become the recognized leader of the Gophers. He was an arrogant, terrifyingly violent kid who bragged to reporters that he had never worked an honest day in his life and never planned to. When asked to describe a typical week, he brazenly listed days filled with sleeping until the afternoon, going to dances, looking at fancy pigeons, and staying up in cabarets and saloons until 5 in the morning. But the police didn't officially nickname him the Killer by age 18 for his dancing skills. At just 14 years old, Owney committed his first murder, brutally bludgeoning an Italian merchant to death with a pipe. When terrified witnesses adhered to the neighborhood's strict code of silence, Owney walked away clean. A year later, over a petty dispute regarding a girl, a 15-year-old Owney chased a store clerk named Willie Henshaw into a trolley car and shot him dead in broad daylight. He led the cops on a wild chase across the 10th Avenue rooftops before being captured. Even though the dying victim identified him, Owney beat the rap yet again when witnesses miraculously vanished before the trial. But ruling the Gophers painted a massive target on his back. On November 6, 1912, the violence spectacularly caught up with him at the Arbor dance hall. Ambushed by an 11-man hit squad that included rival Hudson Dusters, Owney didn't flinch. "Come on, use yellow-bellied dusters," he snarled, reaching for his revolver. "Who'd you punks ever bump off?" The ensuing barrage of gunfire cleared the dance hall and left Owney sprawled on the floor, riddled with a half-dozen bullets. When an investigating detective leaned over his bleeding body to ask who pulled the trigger, the gangster spat back, "It's nobody's business but mine who put these slugs in me. The boys'll take care of them." Miraculously, he survived, and true to his chilling promise, 3 of the suspected shooters were slaughtered in Hell's Kitchen within a week. While Owney was fighting for his life in a hospital bed, a treacherous Gopher underling named Patsy Doyle decided to usurp the throne. Doyle's motive was fueled by pure jealousy. Owney's favorite girl, Frida Horner, used to belong to him. The streets ran red as the two factions warred, but Owney proved to be the ultimate apex predator. Using Frida and another gang moll, Margaret Everdeen, as bait, Madden lured Doyle to a 41st Street saloon on November 28, 1914. 2 anonymous gunmen ambushed Doyle, leaving him to die in the gutter. But the law finally caught up with the killer. In a shocking twist, the women flipped. Frida and Margaret testified against him, and Owney was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in Sing Sing for orchestrating the hit. With their leader behind bars, the legendary Gophers were decimated by police raids, with 16 members locked up by year's end. Fast forward to January 1923. Released early for good behavior, Madden stepped out of prison into a completely transformed world. Prohibition was in full swing, and the streets were paved with illicit bootlegging gold. After a brief, miserable stint doing strong-arm work in the violent taxi business, Owney formed a small crew and started hijacking booze shipments. It was small-time work, but it caught the attention of the biggest fish in the sea, Big Bill Dwyer, the undisputed king of the rum runners. Dwyer had a massive international smuggling ring, but his overland transports were constantly being hijacked by renegade gangs. He summoned Madden to his Times Square office, setting the stage for a legendary criminal alliance. Owney looked Big Bill in the eye and laid out the brutal truth: Dwyer needed to organize the shooters, pay off the cops, and secure the politicians. In that smoky room, 2 Hell's Kitchen boys shook hands, officially giving birth to the unstoppable, ruthless juggernaut known as the New York Irish Mob. Owney the Killer was back, and this time, he wasn't just a street thug, he was the master architect of an empire.